Good morning and welcome.
This was all.
My name is Eileen O'Connell and I manage special collections for the city of Albuquerque. So it is a privilege to welcome so many new and so many familiar faces. I met Nancy when I started this job, and it took a while for me to realize that pretty much everything we have that is unique or cool or just breathtakingly, why did they do that? And what can it tell us about the city? Was something that Nancy had found and contributed to us. And she was instrumental in the digital postcard collection that we have online that we did to celebrate the city's tricentennial. And she knows postcards. She loves Albuquerque. She is an active collector. She is a friend in need whenever we have somebody with questions about their postcard collections. And it is just such a delight that she is with us for part one. There will be other parts coming up in 2018. Next one is scheduled for January. Because when she was putting this together, she said, I have too much stuff. And I was looking at this empty 2018 calendar, and I said, you could break it up. So that's what we've done. And I would love to welcome Nancy Tucker.
Thanks, Eileen. It's true. I had vainly hoped to do one presentation all about the history of postcards in Albuquerque and postcard publishers in Albuquerque. And I had naively thought that I could do all that in one lecture until I started researching this presentation 2 years ago and discovered 19 publishers just between 1900 and 1920. And I panicked. I thought, the people at this lecture are going to get whiplash as I go through all of these slides. Oh, Eileen, could you check, could you
Switch it over.
put the real presentation and give me the clicker too. I was worried about you all getting whiplash because I figured that we would get 30 seconds per publisher. And that was including the picture of the publisher and all the biographical data about the publisher. Eileen suggested to me that I break it up, and I was so relieved. So apparently, we both have benefited from her suggestion about doing this. Can you all hear me in the back row? Wave if you can. Is that a yes or a no?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good, thank you. We are going to, I broke it into 3 pieces. This is really, this was from about 1900 to 1911, right before statehood. There were a whole bunch of events that happened. Albuquerque was a very active community at that point, financially and otherwise. And there were a lot of big events, so I focus on events this time. We will have one presentation on photographers in Albuquerque, the first 20 years of the 20th century. And another of those photographers who made postcards, and then we'll do another on everybody else, which included curio dealers and stationery stores and all kinds of other companies that published postcards in the first 20 years. So let's do a little bit of a history of postcards first, just to give you some background. These are what they call decorated envelopes, and there's a group, there are people who say that decorated envelopes are the ancestors of postcards. This one here and this one here date to the Civil War in the U.S. And this one is even earlier. It goes back to England probably in about the 1830s maybe, 1840s. There are also people who feel that trade cards are the ancestors of postcards. This one here is Arbuckle's Coffee. Arbuckle's produced this nice series of cards. This happens to be their New Mexico card, showing the wild Indians fighting the conquistadors. And this is from Coates Cotton. Anybody who sews, knows about coats, spool, cotton thread. And this is a military uniform, a series, they did a series on military uniforms from, I think it was 1889 to 1890. Okay, this is the world's earliest known picture postcard. It was sent in 1840. It was sent by a fellow by the name of Theodore Hook, Esquire. He was a playwright and novelist and something of a jokester. This is a hand-painted one. These are supposed to be postal clerks working with this huge ink pot here. And he sent this as something of a joke. He sent it to himself. This card sold in 2002, the last time. Well, this languished in the stamp collection for many years because of the penny black stamp that's on it. It was sold, the only time it has been sold, as a postcard in 2002 for the equivalent of $63,000. It was thought up until this thing was discovered that this was among the earliest postcards. This is actually a card printed by the Austrian government. This here says space for written communications. And this said, the postmaster shall not be responsible for the contents of this communication. So what's the difference between a postcard, and a postal card? A postcard and postcard are the same thing. This is the earlier usage, two different words, and of course as we got more modern, we smooshed them together. There are some collectors who still prefer the old usage. It's Moxnix. You can do it or not do it, whatever you want. A postal card, however, is a government-produced card like this one by the Austrian government. If you go to a stamp show to find postcards, as I do sometimes, you have to say picture postcard, because otherwise they will hand you a whole bunch of those government-produced cards. That's how the stamp people know them. Okay, so there are basically two kinds of postcards. There's a printed card, and you can see the little dot pattern here. It's how you know that it's been printed. Or it's a photographic card, what we call a real photo postcard, which is an actual black and white photograph. And it's often stamped on the back. It says authentic photograph, or this is a real photo, or something like that. So there are these two basic types. You will find on eBay, as I do all the time, people listing a colored contemporary postcard as a real photo postcard because it has a photograph on it. But if you look real closely, you will see that dot pattern just like in newspapers. Now, these are some pretty early Albuquerque postal cards. This is 1885 and 1886. And until I started putting this together, I did not realize that these two cards that I had bought in wildly different times were both to the same company, although went to two different locations, the Albuquerque location of the D.L. Samus Company and the Socorro location. And D.L. Samus was a wholesale merchant of produce. They became Samus and Stam, a familiar Albuquerque name. They then became the Bittner Stam Fruit Company, and eventually they just became the Stam Fruit Company, run by brothers Roy and Ray Stam, and I'll be talking about Roy Stam a little bit at the end of this presentation, actually. Now, another kind of card, besides these business communications, was a crime-fighting postal card. This was sent from the Chief of Police of Albuquerque to the Chief of Police in San Diego, because these goods, a diamond pin, a gold pin, a chain of turquoise links, blah, blah, were supposed to, quote, have been stolen by a ruddy-faced boy about 14 years of age, dressed in a Norfolk jacket, dark pants, and light, stiff hat. And if this Chief of Police in San Diego saw this young man in 1888, they were to telegraph the Albuquerque chief of police and get a $25 reward, which was pretty hefty back then. So you found this for missing goods, thieves, missing horses, missing cars, missing people. All kinds of missing things were sent out. This particular card was probably printed at the Albuquerque Citizen, which in addition to doing newspapers, also published, or also was a job printer and printed things like this. Now, the start of the postcard fad in the U.S., and it was a huge fad, I think centering right around maybe 1908 to 1912. The start of the fad was in 1893, the World's Columbian Exhibition. I picked out, to illustrate this, the Women's Building at the World's Columbian because an Albuquerquean was instrumental in getting this going. Mrs. Albright. She had Albright's studio. She was a photographer in the 1880s and 1890s here in Albuquerque. And this is the lovely Mrs. Albright. She was very pretty. She had many different names. Her given name apparently was Emma, and she may have been married before she married Mr. Albright to a Mr. Luce. We don't quite know everything. She died in 1912. Her husband was editor of one of the papers here in town. But this World's Columbian card, there were a whole series of them printed on government backs, but with pretty stuff on the front. And people began to think, oh, I could collect these things. And that sort of began the fad. It was slow to start. This women's building, by the way, was designed by a 21-year-old female architect who, she was trained as an architect, but she was never able to find a job as an architect because, of course, she was A, young, and B, female. Okay, at the national level, in this period that we're talking about, 1900 to 1920, these were presidents. And they go, as you can see, from the Edwardian dress to pretty close to contemporary dress. Yearly income was $750 a year, and that was nationwide. I'm sure in New Mexico it was probably a third to half of that. So keep that in mind when we talk about prices of things. And of course, New Mexico was still a territory in the period that we're going to be talking about today. This is a 47-star flag. There's the difference. And it was never an official 47-star flag because of this reason. I'm not going to insult you by reading it to you. But there are very few of these 47-star flags, as you can imagine, because it was only about a month, 5 weeks, between the time New Mexico was admitted and the time Arizona was admitted. Now, this is what it looked like in downtown Albuquerque at that time. Roads unpaved. Boardwalks were often, not always, wood. You had smoking black chimneys, and the black smoke would be coming out of the chimneys. I have a photograph of the Eldorado, which was a lovely building, and here's this black, ugly smoke coming out of the top of it. And there were lots of dust storms.
Nancy, is that the Rosenwald building?
Yes, it is. This is the Rosenwald building right here, still standing in downtown. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of other nice ones down there. The Rosenwald is still standing. Okay, in 1910, the population was about 11,000, excluding these suburbs. I love Dogtown. Pigeon Town was spelled with two different ways, but obviously some of these areas we still know. They've all been absorbed into the cities. This young couple here, I think probably, given the pile of stuff there, might have been living in the foothills over here. This is wash day. He is working, notice. He is working at the household things. Okay, the first type of real postcard we find in Albuquerque is what we call private mailing cards. The government reserved unto itself from 1898 to 1901 the right to publish postcards, or at least publish this part of the postcard, the address side. You can put what you want on the front. And this one says Making Adobes in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And you see this adobe building, and you see all the adobes nicely laid out there. And there in the back is just the outline of the Sandias. Here's another pair, a New Mexico Express, a bullet wagon. And the street seen in Isleta Village near Albuquerque, New Mexico. And here's another one, 2nd Street looking north, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Probably looking north from Gold, because Gold was the banking street at that point. A lot of major businesses were located on Gold, not on Central. There were also private postcards. Still can't spell. This one dates from 1902. Probably was included in a letter because you don't have any stamp here, and they have written on the address side. Now, if you look at old postcards, you will find a lot of them have writing on the front, as this one does, and that's because until 1907, the government did not trust you to write anything other than the address on this side of the card. 1907, they finally decided that Americans were smart enough to be able to write both the address and a message on the back of the postcard. And if you put a line down the middle, so this is how you know that this card predates 1907, because there's no line down the middle of the back of the card. Leather postcards were a huge fad. I happen to love leather postcards. And they're basically two kinds. This one was commercially produced. You can see that it's been stamped and inked. And these two were handmade. You could buy at the equivalent of a hobby shop what's called a pyrographic machine, which was basically a heated pen. And you would actually burn the leather to do this kind of work. You could also burn wood, or burn your little brother, as I think I did when I had a pyrographic unit when I was a kid. Okay. Now, the first major event that we're going to talk about today were the trade excursions. There were two of them in 1908 and 1909. They were basically an effort by local businessmen to go throughout New Mexico and find out sources of goods that could be purchased in Albuquerque, therefore keeping the business within New Mexico, or find places within New Mexico that Albuquerque goods could go to. We did our first excursion in March of 1908. My thinking is because Denver did one as early as 1905, and they came to Albuquerque, and El Paso, the Texans, came in 2007. They went to Socorro, Belen, Santa Fe, Estancia Valley, and they even came to Albuquerque. The nerve of they spent 7 days of their 8-day, the El Paso ones, of their 8-day trip, they spent 7 days in New Mexico trying to take back the state, probably. There were about 100 to 125 jolly gentlemen, there were no ladies on this, wearing yachting caps with the word Albuquerque, white yachting caps with the word Albuquerque on it. They spent a lot of time talking about what their uniforms would be like. They brought along the Elks Club band, and every time they visited 35 states, everybody would decamp off the train. They would do a little parade in the town. They would do concerts and schmooze a lot. And as you can see from this very partial list of some of the people who were on this particular excursion, was a wide variety of businesses that they were trying to publicize. You got to schmooze with the governor and you could, do business. In a town of 11,000, these guys probably all knew each other anyway, but it was a time to get acquainted a little bit better. They had a special train that the Santa Fe Railway provided them with an engine, a baggage car, and 5 sleeper cars. It cost $25. They did so well on this thing, they were actually able to refund $4 to each of the participants, showing very businesslike. They provided all kinds of souvenirs. I mean, the baggage car must have been filled with souvenirs. They had leather postcards, they had wooden postcards, they had yardsticks, they had canes, cigar cases, notebooks. They just must have thrown this stuff off the train to people. In 1909, they did another. Oh, I forgot to say about this one here. The Morning Journal offered a prize for the best songs that could be sung on the excursion. Here were the tunes, and some of the tunes that you could use to compose your lyrics. Auld Lang Syne, In the Good Old Summertime, Hot Time in the Old Time Tonight, and Nobody Knows How Dry I Am. I would love to know what some of those song lyrics were. I haven't seen them, but I would love to know. In 1909, they did another trip. They went all the way down to El Paso. And covered even more than the 35 towns that they had done previously. We know that this is an actual postcard published in San Marcial by a woman. Very unusual to have a woman publisher of postcards in the West. We know it's the 1909 excursion because there's a bear here. Her name is Alice. She was the pet of somebody in San Marcial. And the jolly excursioneers took her on board their train for a couple of days. And it must have been a handful because the band that year wasn't the Elks Club band. It was the boy band of the Leonard and Lindemans musical company. Here are the band members over here. So they had a bunch of boys with musical instruments, a brown bear, careening around New Mexico and all the way down to El Paso. On their way back, they stopped in Socorro, unloaded the bear, who went back to her home. Got back to Albuquerque and were too tired for the parade to the Elks Club. It was a buffet prepared for them. Now, among the postcards that was available is this one, and I'm sorry that it doesn't reproduce very well, so I gave you the text here. Can you see that text in the back? No. Okay. It says, "Dear Sir," it's March 10th, 1908. This is the first one. "If you pine for a change, spruce up and sashay yourself to Albuquerque, New Mexico. If you'll come to Albuquerque, more ties would bind you than you can count. You can board cheap and you will simply adore the place. You can bet you will have a great time and nothing will be molding. You may find yourself lumbering among the many sites or may get waterlogged or floored, but we will run you in on the siding and be with you at the finish. No danger of getting in a box. Come and see us and you can tell your friends you sawdust." These were made in the tens of thousands by the American Lumber Company, who provided 15,000 of them to the excursioneers in 1908, thus rating themselves the official souvenir of the 08 excursion. They also were used at a lot of other occasions. Despite the rather large numbers of these that were made, you don't find them very often. I've only seen a couple of them. The address side, and this is just half of the address side, I figure you didn't need to see it, was actually paid for by a number of different merchants. Here's the Bittner Stam Fruit Company, familiar name. And this is the Southwestern Brewery and Ice Company. It says beer and ice and New Mexico industry, bottled beer, a specialty right for prices. And there were, as I say, a number of different ones. of these. A couple of enterprising young men in 1907 took some of these to Denver for the Democratic Convention, and William Jennings Bryant's picture was in this part on the address side, and the young men sold them for $1 or so a piece. So they were a very popular souvenir. This, the cards themselves, this side was printed by the Albuquerque Journal, and this side was printed by the Lithgow Printing Company. Okay, UNM also had several hundred of these done. I have not seen the UNM cards yet. That's one of the things that distinguishes postcard collecting from stamp collecting or coin collecting. In stamp collecting and coin collecting, the governments have issued these things. Therefore, there are lists of them. In postcard collecting, there is no master list of all the postcards, the millions of different kinds of postcards that have ever been published. There are lists of certain publishers. Those have been put together by collectors, but there is no master list. That means you never know what's out there. And that's what, to me, makes postcard collecting so exciting. It always is a hunt. And in preparing this particular lecture, I found things in my own postcard collection that I didn't know that I had. And learned a lot more depth about some of the things that I do have. Okay, the next big event happened in September, October 1908, and it was the National Irrigation Congress. Now, this was a national level meeting. Actually, an Irrigation Congress had been held in Albuquerque in 1885. It was a very small event. This one, everybody went all out because they had the National Irrigation Congress, basically a big convention. They had an industrial exposition and the state fair all at the same time, and the circus arrived a week before. So it was a big September, October for Albuquerqueans. This is the official card. It was also official postcard. This is a copy of the design that was used on the official souvenir booklet. This card here, Exhibition Building, University of New Mexico's 16th National Irrigation Congress and Industrial Exposition, was printed on the Gameter multigraph used in the commercial department of the university. A little bragging on the part of UNM. This is the address side of the card. There were also many thousands of these put out. This is an accordion folder. Only the other side of the back of this was for the address, and inside you had a whole accordion kind of group of pictures. These are the gentlemen who were in charge of planning this event. This was the official drawing. And here are some of the pictures from the inside of that folder. This is the commercial club. It was the headquarters for the Irrigation Congress. Here's one of the exhibit buildings, and this is why you should never trust what you see on a postcard, because those are drawn in, those are not real flags. That's not a real flag, and that probably isn't a real flag either. The convention hall was the National Guard Armory, which was finished about a month before the Irrigation Congress opened. Here are some of the here are some of the arches that decorated the exhibition area, which was held at the, what they called the traction grounds, I believe it was. It was the state fairgrounds, which was west of Old Town. These street arches, it sounds so contemporary. Science bids the desert drink. Well, I mean, language isn't contemporary, but make homes in the land, save the forests, and the National Irrigation Congress arch there. And these are a couple of the exposition buildings. Now, they made these these folders were given away, and the way they were paid for is something we know about today, which was commercial sponsorship. The inside back of the folder had ads. Here's a nice interior view, and you don't see interior views in this period very often because the lighting was very difficult to do, of the Golden Rule Dry Goods Company here in town. Here's another of the Southwestern Brewery and Ice Company. Gross Kelly, a wholesale grocer, the Bank of Commerce. And the other two that I have not seen are the First National Bank and D. Rubin during the store. So this is how those free folders were paid for. Now these gentlemen are, again, the leaders and Uncle Sam of the Irrigation Congress. And this is a postcard that probably was not sold on the official grounds because it's a caricature. It was published by the Vista Press, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. Published locally by the Vista Press. These are the guys, the great and good, I call them. And look at how shiny these top hats are. Is that amazing or what? And you know who are the richer ones because they're wearing the top hats as opposed to the bowlers. And one lady in the group. And these guys are the photographers and other assorted ne'er-do-wells. I think this is a man I'm going to be talking about later. His name is Milton Porter. But I'm not sure. But I love the contrast between this and this. These are, I'm getting out of the postcard realm a little bit just because I was so excited to find these photographs at UNM. It's a whole album of photographs of the Irrigation Congress and events. Here's the Elks Club, all tricked out and bunting. He did a land office, somebody did a land office stay on bunting. This is the National Guard Armory, again. Here's a postcard. And this is what somebody said. They're lining up on First Street. You can barely see the Eldorado here, I think it is, for one of the parades. There were several parades. And this is, it says all the way. And this is a float from one of the parades. In here, on the front, right there, it says December in New Mexico. And here it says December in the East. There's all the snow and there's all the green vegetation. Yeah.
In the eastern United States.
The Women's Christian Temperance Union, with all the children dressed in white, purity, purity, purity. And here is the entrance gate where you paid your 50 cents if you were an adult, 25 cents if you were a kid, and your team of horses was not allowed to pass these gates. Santa Fe Railroad had an exterior building. This is a Superior Lumber and Mill Company of Albuquerque, had a building. UNM had a building. It was designed by the university itself, people at the university, and built by a contractor. I think that the exterior might have been burlap or something because it's clearly not adobe because you can see the wrinkles in the surface here. But the thing was hollow. You could go inside it and see exhibits that were made by university students. And the university itself shut down for the entire period of the Irrigation Congress. The excuse was that the faculty members were needed to staff this thing on the inside. Here's interior exhibits. This is Bernalillo County. You can see all the tomatoes or plums or something, these huge boards. There were exhibitors who came from out of state. I love this elephant made out of alfalfa or something, and I think these might be onions. And if you've ever been to a convention and seen bored salesmen sitting around, there's bored salesmen. And these were the representatives in session. They came from a number of different countries and continents even, including Australia, Africa, England, France, where else? Let's see. Yeah, England, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Austria, as well as Australia, and some places in Africa, and El Paso. Okay. Mostly you see the ladies up here, and there are a few ladies down here, but mostly it's gentlemen, of course.
Nancy, what is CSWR?
Oh, Center for Southwest Research, I'm sorry. That is the research center at Zimmerman Library at UNM. And they have, if you've never been there, they have wonderful things available to do research with. It is a very fine research facility. So you played hard, or you worked hard during the day, and at night you went to the Eldorado, which was all lit up. And here's a postcard, maybe of the same people, I'm not sure. Dear Mother, we are going to have a fine time at the Irrigation Congress. Expect 40,000 people. We are well. Now remember, the population was somewhere around 10, 11,000. So 40,000 is an awful lot, I'm going to go back a few slides here to show you how they took care of some of those 40,000 people. Here's the Elks Club, and here is a Tint Restaurant. I was reading just last night that they tried to make sure that there was no price gouging. When you quadruple the size of the town, who knows? At the end of the Congress, you could go home with a trophy, perhaps. This is Eddy County's, won by Eddy County, New Mexico, against the world. And they made a postcard there. It's the best county exhibit. And these are some other postcards made around the same time. They're dated October 08. Somebody took a camera around Albuquerque and snapped these shots and either developed them themselves or had a professional photo processor use what they call a mask, in this case the shape of an apple, to encompass these scenes. Now, I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about my favorite postcard publisher in Albuquerque. His name was M.E. Porter, or Milton Edison Porter. He moved here in about 1899 or 1900, probably to deal with his tuberculosis. But unlike most TB patients in Albuquerque, he had tuberculosis of the spine. Which I talked with the doctor once about this, and he told me it is very painful. And Porter's history in Albuquerque and environs kind of indicated that it was painful because he would have periods of working and then periods when he couldn't work. And, periods when he could work, periods when he couldn't work. He was, let's see now. So this is the young man. He came here as the assistant for the International Correspondence School of Scranton, Pennsylvania. They taught correspondence courses in bookkeeping, plumbing, window dressing. I don't know how you could teach plumbing and window dressing by correspondence. He had to resign the position of the traveling superintendent, which meant he went to other towns to try to persuade people to sign up because of ill health. It was called at the time inflammatory rheumatism. And instead of being the traveling salesman, he took charge of the branch itself. In one of these episodes, it was so bad that the local authorities corresponded with his family back home, letting them know about his condition. He had to resign the school in 1903 for health reasons. He just could not keep it up. After a few months of rest, he went to work as a bookkeeper and clerk at the Hardscrabble Mining Company in the mountains outside Magdalena. If he wanted a rest, that doesn't sound like a rest to me. He then moved back to Albuquerque. He and his wife moved back to Albuquerque, very patient woman apparently, and worked as a photographer for F.J. Houston and Holly on the Corner. And then he set up his own studio on South 2nd Street and later moved to Gold Avenue. Now, the reason I like his postcards is I think that they are beautifully produced. You can read these. There are about maybe 16 different cards, something like that. And they were printed by a company called the Rotograph Company, which had its offices on Broadway in New York City, but actually did the printing in Germany. And it wasn't unusual at this time for postcards to be printed in Germany because they had the best printers in the world. So if you were in an outback place like Albuquerque, you would gather your materials, send them off to Rotograph in New York City. They would rework the materials, send them to Germany, print them in Germany, send them back to Rotograph, who then sent them back to you all in about 2 or 3 months, which, considering the transportation of the time, is pretty remarkable. And they would be sold for a penny or two. Really quite remarkable.
The Barnett Building, is it still around?
No.
Where was that at?
Actually, I think the frame of the building is...
Second and Central,
It's second, yeah.
burned down in the 1960s.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, there we go. I was thinking of a different building. Okay. It's a very nice building, though, isn't it? Yes, it's really too bad. So, here are some more views. This is where we're actually sitting right now, the Reynolds Library. This was the second public library in Albuquerque. The first one was at the Commercial Club. This one was a public library, and it also was a school, and God knows what else also met in this building. And this is UNM, the first couple of buildings at UNM. He also did a limited number of real photo postcards. Here's the same car. He called it Robinson Park here, and he called it City Park right there. This is so clear, you can read this sign on this tree which said 8th Street. Now, like a number of photographers, he did what they called Indian views. These are not postcards. I have not found, so far anyway, any Porter postcards of Indians. These are either business card size or postcard sized photographs, and then they have the back that looks like this, telling what he did. So it was a kind of a publicity thing for him. At the time this was done, he had a partner, Henry Neff. Porter often had younger men working with him. Porter would go out to the pueblos, and he made friends with people at the pueblos. They actually invited him into their home, which is something they did not do with very many people at all. The Albuquerque Evening Herald said, and I'm going to quote this, "They knew that he desired to take their photographs for purposes more worthy and sincere than the average tourist and sightseer. Consequently, were always willing to pose for him and to admit him to their homes. The Porter collection of Indian photographs is valuable and one of the most complete in existence." Well, there is no complete collection of Porter photographs. I have a few of them. I have one of them up here that you can look at afterwards, framed at the time, so you'll notice the kind of very nice framing he had. By 1909, 1910, Porter was no longer listed in the city directory as a photographer. He was just called a traveling salesman, and we have no idea what it was that he was selling. He probably was too sick at that point to work very much. He died in like 1911 in Los Terranes. He was only 35. He had a blood clot due to his tuberculosis, and he left a wife and 2 children. He'd been sick for about 2 weeks before he died, and he's buried in Fairview. The Albuquerque Journal noted that at his funeral, 1 or 2 Pueblo Indians lingered outside and peered wistfully into the room. They didn't feel comfortable going into the room. He was buried as a Christian Scientist. But they appeared at his funeral, which I think was pretty impressive. Over the years, as I said, Porter had a number of young men working for him. Henry Neff was likely a single young man because he lived in a hotel for 3 years. He probably was taken on as a junior partner because Porter was getting a little bit sick. Now, one of the young men, let's see, no, let's go on to the next. Excuse me, while I deal with my notes. Okay, Feitz and Lyon. And Feitz and Lyon are linked with Porter in a way that I will explain. The only way I found out that these cards were printed by Feitz and Lyon is this one line on one card, printed by Feitz and Lyon Publishing Company. These are a series of cards given out right around the time of the Irrigation Congress by The Economist, which was a major department store here in Albuquerque. They were also known as Weinman & Lewis and Dry Goods Store. Here is their advertisement. It's actually part of the advertisement in a much larger advertisement, giving a welcome to visitors and inviting them to come to the store to use the restroom, and I'll show you one of those, with a writing desk and telephone for your convenience. Also for a postal card showing pictures of the various departments also of our building. So this is the millinery department, the main floor looking from upstairs. Very unusual to have these interior photographs at the time, which shows that Mr. Feitz, who was the photographer and artist in this company, had some skills. Here is the suit room. You have ladies' suits. This is the rest room. And the rest room actually was to rest. You had chairs. There's a writing desk, a place for ladies to loosen their stays. And here is the exterior of the building, as promised.
Where was it?
Huh?
Where was the building?
I'm sorry, I don't know exactly.
200 block of South Central.
I love working with historians. Somebody always gives me answers to everything. 200 block.
I think it was about 208.
Okay, but roughly 208 south on Central. Okay. Now, Mr. Feitz, in addition to being a photographer, also did some nice drawings. This is Progressive Albuquerque, a booklet that they put together. Again, something for the Irrigation Congress, published in 1908 by Feitz and Lyon. They combine his photographs with his drawings and the like.
You have mermaids.
Mermaids, and well, it's pretty stuff in 1908. I guess there are mermaids in the Rio Grande, all rivers must have mermaids. This is the commercial club here. Feitz, Sam Feitz, his name was a married French Canadian. Now, everything I'm going to tell you about Feitz, take with a grain of salt, because it's pretty clear that the man had a tongue, even though he said he was French Canadian. He bragged a lot. He told of having worked in Paris and London, claimed to have photographed many famous stage people and members of the monarchies. He claimed Edwin Booth, the famous actor Edwin Booth, was a warm personal friend, and said he was an official designer for the Santa Fe Railroad. I can verify none of this. Mr. Lyon worked for the National Life Insurance Company. He was probably the money guy, while Feitz was the creative guy. Feitz came to town in about 1907. He established Feitz Electrical Studio, which probably meant he had electricity and used lights to light things. He made some drawings of the American Lumber Company that were so successfully received at the lumber company that they used them on their stationery and their advertising materials. Now, I've showed you their postcards, I've showed you their booklet, and we're going to talk about the theft. Mr. Porter, let's go back to Milton Porter. As I said, had a succession of young men working for him. One of them was a guy named Donald Parker, who was about 19 years old. He came to town with a decent education, but no money. He made friends with men who spent more money than he had. So he supplemented his income with theft, apparently. He embezzled from his employer, Mr. Porter, and it seems that he took something very valuable to a photographer, either a camera or a lens. The newspaper accounts differ, whether it was the full camera or whether it was the lens. Anyway, somewhere around August of 1908, he stole this. It then appeared a couple of months later in the possession of Mr. Feitz. Oh, imagine that. Feitz said he bought it from a native, i.e., some Indian stole it and I bought it from him. He also said that he bought it from some camera company in Chicago or some camera company back east. His story kept changing. Eventually, Porter brought a charge against him. They went to trial. In November of 1908, both Mr. Feitz and the young Mr. Parker were found guilty and sentenced to a year. A year in the state pen. They were a lot harder on crime in Albuquerque then than we are now. These are pretty grim-looking buildings, I gotta tell you. Okay. Feitz dropped out of sight after he went to the penitentiary, and Mr. Lyons apparently continued to be an upstanding citizen. He wasn't looking at all kind of that. All right, let's go back to postcards. Postcard Day. Who ever heard of such a thing? Well, our governor, Mr. Mills at that point, wanted to promote the state in advance of statehood. This is roughly 7 months before we became a state. He wanted to draw more people here, agricultural people, business people, everybody. Kind of anglicize the state a little bit more, the territory a little bit more. And the various companies in Albuquerque helped publicize this thing, Postcard Day, from John Lee Clark. He was a curio dealer, Strong's bookstore, E.J. Strong, and even the people who produced Gloria Beer are boosting New Mexico on Postcard Day. The idea was to send postcards to your friends, and they always said back east, they never said west. Although a lot of people, sent them to the Midwest as well, to just publicize the state. The commercial club bought 5,000, 6,000 or so of these cards. They were pre-printed and had this particular message printed on the back. The heart of the well, Albuquerque, the heart of the well company, health, wealth, and comfort. Climate ideal, both summer and winter. Population increased 100% in 10 years. Bank deposits more than $6 million. Growth sure. Opportunities great. For literature, write to the Secretary of the Commercial Club, Albuquerque, New Mexico. This card was actually mailed on Postcard Day, June 22nd, 1911, to the Assistant Treasurer of the adjacent Topeka and Santa Fe Railway in Topeka. And that's what they wanted to do, what they called boosting the state. Let's see now.
What building is that?
This is Wataka Hall, which was they called it the boys' dormitory, men's dormitory at UNM. And they had probably about a dozen different views. These were produced by the Detroit publishing company, so they probably got them pretty cheap. Although Detroit published monster numbers of cards, many of these cards were also sold at the Eldorado Hotel, without the special message on the back. Here are some other kinds of boosting cards. Moreno Valley is up where Eagle Nest is. This is an actual photograph here. This is sent out by a real estate agent in Raton. Here, again, agriculture and real estate. Breaking the sod at Amistad, New Mexico. You could be like your ancestors and break the sod. And this says, this is the long and the short of it, with the tall man and the short man here in front of the business. The nice thing about these real photo postcards, there are a number of nice things about the photo postcards. One of them is that you get views that you wouldn't get otherwise. They could be made in very limited quantities, and that's what makes them sometimes so valuable. They were made in very limited quantities. People use these in their genealogical research, and so forth and so on. And you could either have a professional photographer make them, or in this case, they were probably made by somebody who had a Kodak. And that's what they called cameras. You just went Kodaking. You didn't distinguish a Kodak from any other kind of camera. Everything was a Kodak. Like we talk about Kleenex now. They talked about Kodaking. Here's a booster type card. It was mailed in advance of Postcard Day to England. Boost for New Mexico, where you can sleep under blankets the year round and see the sun 365 days. Sent to England, where they don't have sun 365 days. And this is a familiar problem. That's still true. They estimated that 1 million to 1.5 million pieces of mail went out on that day. I mean, the poor postmen were overloaded with the outgoing mail. In addition to postcards, people sent letters. Many newspapers around the state published special editions of information about New Mexico, and from 0 cents to a nickel, you could pay your local newspaper to send the copy of that edition of the paper to some friend back east of the Mississippi, where they don't know that we were about to be a state, or at least part of the USA. Okay. Now, going to the booster press. Remember these guys here? Okay. Booster press was a small operation run out of a guy's home in, let's see, I have to find the name of the street here. His name was Ralph Noble, and he was apparently quite a promoter. He did just these couple of postcards that I have been able to find so far. These are very rare. I actually don't have one in my collection. I borrowed these images from 2 fellow deltiologists is our studi name. Postcard collector is our ordinary name. But Noble also produced this monthly magazine. He had a home at 501 South Walter, which is just over here, and eventually moved it. He became a generalized printer. He employed his daughter as a solicitor, they called it, which is the person who goes out and solicits ads and subscriptions and so forth. And copies of this magazine, I am losing this pointer, so I'm, excuse me for a second, going to try to find one of my other pointers, which I have misplaced, so I guess I will use the pointer on this, and now I'm going to make all kinds of mistakes. Okay. This only was published for a couple of years. The Albuquerque Museum has a copy of it, the library here has a copy of it. It's filled with boostering material, articles about Albuquerque, how great it is, and so forth and so on. He went out to fires. This is the Continental Oil Company fire. He produced this real photo postcard here. And he must have made this postcards the same day because this line, which usually is printed, is in ink, the Booster Press, corner Cole and Walter Street. He probably, sold these for a nickel a piece the day of this big fire. He also used images that he shot here in the magazine. There's the Continental Oil Company fire there. I think this is by Ralph Noble. It says, photo by R.K. Noble, 505 South High Street, although I couldn't find any indication of him living there. This is the sundial at UNM. This is an example of, again, somebody taking their own Kodak, the camera, taking a Kodak, this photo, and making it into a postcard, and then just writing sundial, U of NM, on it. Okay, that was Ralph Noble. He disappeared after a couple of years. He sold his business to a younger partner and disappears from Albuquerque. Our last subject, Roy Stam. Roy was one of the children of a noted Albuquerque family. He and Mr. Joseph Blondine, who was a noted balloonist, went to the air in October of 1909. Roy had bought this balloon, which is a silk balloon. I didn't realize it was made out of silk. It looked like rubber to me. And they launched from 6th and Central at 11 o'clock in the morning, which is pretty late for a balloon to go up. They had given some tethered rides, 500 feet of rope, and for $1 you could go soaring 500 feet above Albuquerque. A lot of people came down green in the gills, they say. I know I would have been. But they decided that they wanted to go on a great adventure, hopefully as far as California or maybe even Honolulu. The paper notes that they carried a lot of impedimenta. Well, you couldn't get away with that word in the paper today. Desert water bags, camera, thermos bottle, 6-shooter, and lastly, bright red souvenir postal cards, each with a small leaden donkey attached, stamped and ready for mailing to be thrown out as the balloon passes towns. Okay, that's why I was interested in this. It's the postcards, of course. Well, they didn't get to California, they didn't get to Honolulu, they didn't even get north to Colorado where they thought they might get. They ended up in Lucy, New Mexico, which is east of Willard. But they did get as high as 13,000 feet. They were in the air for 2.5 hours. They got low enough that they kept having to throw ballast overboard. And I don't know if one of these little postcards on a bright red, they called it a postcard, of course it's just a mailing tag, but it's red. And here are the 2 little donkeys.
Do you have one?
I do have one. It's the only one I've ever seen. This was sent via a railroad post office. They actually had post offices on rail cars. And you can tell it says RPO down here from one of the Albuquerque lines to an 8-year-old boy who lived in upstate New York. I tracked this whole thing down here. I was curious. Okay, so why were there so many postcards in Albuquerque then? My theory is that part of it was the sands. There were a lot of sanitariums here. People were bored. They needed to write home to family members. It was cheaper to write a postcard at a penny for a stamp, at a penny for the card, than it was to send a letter. There also were a lot of trains. 16 trains a day came through Albuquerque. Yeah. And those people, you know, had half an hour to get off the train while the train was being refueled, and they would go postcard shopping. I read one account of up in Las Vegas, people would get off the train and they would not even go to the lunch counter. They would just go straight looking for postcards, to the point where the lunch counter finances were suffering. I also read about an account talking about how many postcards could go out of one of these trains. An account of a group of Texas bankers on their way to an exposition in Seattle in 1909, I think it was. There were about 125 people aboard this special train. They pulled in at 2 o'clock in the morning. They left at noon the next day, and 1,000 postcards went out just from that one load. And that was just out of the Eldorado. Now, you could buy postcards there at the Eldorado. They had a number of different outlets. Or you could run across the street to the Eldorado Pharmacy. That was its name. It wasn't connected with the hotel. Or to John Lee Clark's Curio Store and buy cards. He had them inside. He had somebody standing outside selling cards. They were everywhere. They were everywhere. So that's my theory about why there were a lot of postcards coming out of Albuquerque. And a lot of companies set up to provide those postcards. It was easy to become a postcard dealer. All you had to do was be a photographer. And you didn't even have to be a particularly good one to make postcards. And lastly, we have the front of the Indian Building here at the Eldorado complex. The ladies lined up selling their pottery. And here is a man standing at the mailbox, posting his postcard. Thank you very much.